Bashar al-Assad has fallen after a lightning blitz by Syrian rebels charging out of Idlib in northwestern Syria. The only thing faster than the rebel advancement was the retreat of the Syrian army, who sieged village after village, city after city for 2 weeks straight until the Assad regime officially collapsed in Damascus on December 8th. So after 50 years in power, 12 years of civil war, the Assad regime finally falls after a 12-day offensive. So how did this happen? In this video, we'll take you through the rebel offensive and the political developments leading up to it. Please consider subscribing to our channel. Also, if you'd like to support what we do, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on our website, where we post exclusive documentaries, podcasts, and videos just like this one about geopolitics, current events, and history. We built this website because of continued censorship of our videos, so please do consider becoming a member. In 2019, after 8 years of fighting, the Syrian civil war was at a standstill. While he hadn't secured all of Syria, Bashar had regained much of the country's territory and its largest cities with the support of Russia, Iran, and armed Shia militias from foreign countries. The most important victory was the recapture of Syria's largest city, Aleppo, in 2016, where Assad's forces defeated a decentralized coalition of free Syrian rebels. By 2019, Bashar al-Assad had regained control of 8 out of the 10 largest cities in Syria, with the exception of Raqqa and Qamishli, held by US-backed Kurdish forces. With Assad's string of victories, the decentralized Syrian rebels struggling to coordinate effectively, and the incoming Trump administration signaling they were not interested in getting the US dragged into another Middle Eastern war, the Gulf monarchies, who provided much of the funding for the rebel weaponry, decided to suspend their sponsorship of the CIA Timber Sycamore program, which facilitated the transfer of these weapons. The Gulf monarchies' exit from the conflict was a signal that the war might soon come to an end. However, Turkey, which shares a long border with Syria, refused to detach themselves from the conflict. As an early supporter of the revolution and its rebels, Erdogan opened his borders to millions of Syrian refugees fleeing the conflict. And with 14 million Kurdish people in Turkey, many of whom living in the south, some with aspirations of Kurdish independence, Erdogan became increasingly worried about the potentiality of a new Kurdish state forming in northeastern Syria. Turkey has spent decades fighting armed Kurdish separatists inside their borders and has made clear that a Kurdish state on their border would be a threat to their territorial integrity and therefore their national security. The Kurdish groups in Syria were organized into a loose coalition of groups known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, and received lots of funding, training, and weaponry from the United States in order to fight ISIS. Turkey became uneasy watching Syrian Kurdish groups become stronger and worried that some of these Kurdish weapons might get smuggled across the border to Kurdish separatists in Turkey who might use those weapons during an attack. So the Turks considered their military presence and support for Arab Syrian rebels as a strategic imperative. But with the rebels losing more and more territory, Erdogan made an agreement with both Russia and Iran to effectively freeze the conflict so they could make way for a negotiated settlement. This negotiation became known as the Astana Agreement, named after the city in Kazakhstan where the first meeting took place. In exchange for Turkey agreeing not to provide the Syrian rebels with any sophisticated weapons that might pose a legitimate threat to the Assad regime, both Russia and Iran agreed to allow Turkey to establish a buffer zone in northern Syria, where they could maintain military outposts and bases, supplemented with Syrian rebels, to sever as much Turkish territory as possible from the Kurdish SDF. The Turks also wanted the Syrian rebel groups they supported to maintain control of at least the Idlib province in northwest Syria so that Syrian refugees could relocate there instead of continuing to pour into Turkey. After losing Aleppo in 2016, these Syrian rebels retreated to this stronghold in Idlib, where they've remained ever since. So this is essentially how Syria would look for the next 5 years. Bashar al-Assad's forces, the Russians, Iran, and armed Shia militants took up positions along Syria's major cities, major roads, and the Euphrates River. The Kurdish SDF forces, supported by US troops and a number of American outposts and bases, controlled the territory on the other side of the river, in the east and northeast of the country. And the Turks and Syrian opposition groups held Idlib province and the buffer zones of northern territory that Turkey had captured. Turkey, Iran, and Russia would then spend the next few years trying to negotiate a complete end to the war that would satisfy everyone's interests. This process was fragile and shaky, but held as all three parties shared a desire to strangle the Kurds and eventually end the conflict as a whole. But they could never seem to agree on a final solution, so the negotiations dragged on and on for years. Uncomfortable with Turkish and rebel presence in Idlib, however, Bashar's forces did not respect the Astana Agreement and continued to grind away at their positions. 3 out of the 4 de-escalation zones that Turkey, Iran, and Russia had agreed to were attacked and recaptured by Bashar's forces. Bashar wanted to reach an agreement with Turkey and end the conflict, but from a stronger position, so he played hardball. Bashar understood the fragile economic and political position Erdogan found himself in. Anti-refugee sentiments were brewing in Turkey. The presence of millions of Syrian refugees fueled a surge of Turkish nationalism. A growing number of Turks viewed the millions of Arab-speaking Syrian refugees as a growing liability and burden, taking jobs, housing, and resources away from Turkish citizens. This movement nearly cost Erdogan the presidency in 2023, where he only barely won his re-election campaign. And in 2024, Erdogan's party lost the popular vote for the first time since it started running for elections in 2002, and it lost regions that had been previously considered AK party strongholds. And with growing inflation on the lira, maintaining the military outposts, a modern border security network, and funding the Syrian rebel groups in northern Syria was becoming increasingly costly to the Turkish government. To make matters worse, a devastating earthquake struck the Turkish-Syrian border, killing over 60,000 people, displacing 3 million people, and producing over $100 billion worth of damage. It was the largest financial loss from a natural disaster in Turkey's history. All of these factors combined into a ticking time bomb for Erdogan that would threaten to oust him and his political party from power. So Erdogan needed to wrap up the war and send millions of Syrian refugees home before it was too late. Bashar knew this and dragged out negotiations, despite being urged by both Iran and Russia to finalize an agreement. But Bashar was reluctant to accept the return of the Syrian refugees coming from Turkey for 2 main reasons. 1, they hated him and his regime and could potentially rebel against him again in the future. And 2, the Syrian economy was in a pathetic state. He did not want to be responsible for providing jobs, housing, electricity, and food for millions of extra people when he could barely provide that to the population he already ruled over. So Bashar felt that time was on his side and that he could extract further concessions from Erdogan if he just bided his time. And with Bashar re-entering the Arab League after renormalizing relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, he felt that his position would only continue to improve. But this delay would ultimately lead to Bashar's downfall because he failed to recognize that he was also in a race against time, probably more so than Erdogan. Russian air support was crucial to propping up Bashar's army. But with the Ukraine war breaking out in 2022, the Russians had to divert both their attention and their resources away from Syria. And the US, which still maintained a military presence, occupied Syrian oil fields and wheat farms, cutting off Bashar's regime from crucial revenues to fund both his army and the regime. Then Hamas attacked on October 7th and triggered a war between Israel and the Axis of Resistance. This escalated Israel's air bombings of Irani Hezbollah supply lines moving through Syria. After October 7th, Israel had become fiercely committed to destroying the Axis of Resistance, declaring an intent to sever the relationship between Iran and Syria to destroy the supply lines. Israel also killed a significant number of commanders, generals, and advisors who were crucial to leading the Shia militias defending Bashar al-Assad in Syria. For example, when Israel bombed the Irani consulate in Damascus on April 1st, 2024, they killed 8 high-level Irani officers. With a single strike, Israel significantly weakened the key human resources leading the effort to defend Bashar in Syria, and that was just one of hundreds of other airstrikes. And crucially, during this entire process of prolonged negotiations, US sanctions, the Russians distracted in Ukraine, the Axis weakened by Israel, and Bashar engaging in seesaw diplomacy with the Gulf monarchies, the Free Syrian rebels continued their training in Idlib. Now, one thing that must be understood about the Kurdish Syrian Democratic Forces, the Free Syrian Army, and the Islamic jihadist groups that formed in opposition to Bashar al-Assad after the revolution is that they are made up of a number of smaller factions that coalesce together into umbrella organizations. They are decentralized, meaning they operate autonomously and independently of one another, but in coordination towards a specific goal. So as you can imagine, coordinating on a unified and effective strategy of war and governance was difficult. The secular Free Syrian Army coalition and the Islamic Jihad coalitions both share a disdain for the regime and sought to topple Bashar al-Assad, but have divergent agendas as they hail from different parts of Syria and subscribe to different political philosophies and religious schools of thought. The Free Syrian Army is considered a secular, pro-democratic umbrella, while the Islamists are interested in Islamic governance and Sharia law. Both coalitions allied together to oppose Assad, but disagreed on how to carry out the war and what a future Syrian government might look like. To paint you a picture of what these groups would disagree on, let's briefly explore Operation Euphrates Shield, Turkey's first military incursion into northern Syria, which took place in 2016. Turkey's objective was to occupy Syrian territory and establish a buffer zone. To do this, they need to battle both ISIS and the Kurdish SDF forces. As you can imagine, Syrian groups in both the Islamic and Free Syrian Army coalitions took issue with this. From their perspective, they were fighting to liberate Syria, not fighting for Turkey to occupy it. Even if they needed support from the Turks, they did not want to become a proxy army for foreign agendas. Some also took issue with fighting fellow Sunni jihadists in ISIS. This led to a split in the group Ahrar al-Sham, an Islamist umbrella group fighting against Bashar. After a fatwa, units in the groups splintered and formed a new group, Jaysh al-Ahrar. This is just one example of the internal politics plaguing both the secular and Islamist Syrian rebels. On one side, you had idealists refusing to compromise, and on the other, you had pragmatists willing to coordinate with whoever could help them achieve their goals. But after the fall of Aleppo in 2016, there was a consensus that these groups needed to reform and reorganize, especially after a number of Islamist groups began fighting each other in Idlib over internal disagreements. In response to this situation, a well-respected rebel commander with Ahrar al-Sham named Abu Jabir al-Sheikh called for various Syrian Islamist groups to get their act together and merge into a unified and focused umbrella organization. This new umbrella organization would be called Hayat al-Tahrir al-Sham, the Organization for the Liberation of the Levant, otherwise known as HTS. 6 different groups answered the call to join this organization: Jaysh al-Ahrar, Ansar al-Din, Jaysh al-Sunnah, Liwa al-Haq, the Nur al-Din al-Zanji movement, and Jabhat Fatah al-Sham. Together, the newly formed HTS coalition would field about 20,000 men. Another important thing to know about these jihadist groups is that they are formed by Syrian Islamists in Syria. Their ranks are supplemented by foreign fighters, but the majority are in fact Syrians themselves. Many of the founders and leaders of these groups had been arrested and tortured by the Assad regime for opposition in the past. For example, Abu Jabir al-Sheikh, the man who called for the new merger, had been arrested by the Assad regime in the mid-2000s and served time in the famous Sidnaya prison where he was tortured. The most powerful and influential group in this new HTS merger, however, was Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, formerly known as Jabhat al-Nusra. Jabhat al-Nusra was formed in 2012 by Syrian members of Al-Qaeda as a Salafi jihadist organization group committed to toppling Bashar al-Assad, uniting other Islamist forces in the country, and establishing a new Syrian government governed by Islamic Sharia. Al-Nusra quickly became one of the fiercest and most powerful rebel groups in Syria. In 2012, the US designated them a terrorist organization. In 2013, after ISIS declared a global caliphate, their leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi demanded the allegiance, obedience, and loyalty of the other Islamist rebel groups in Syria. Jabhat al-Nusra and many others refused. A young Syrian commander with over a decade of experience fighting in both Syria and Iraq, a man named Abu Muhammad al-Jolani. Jolani severed the relationship with Al-Qaeda and rebranded into Jabhat Fatah al-Sham, and a year later, Jolani and Fatah al-Sham would join the HTS merger. Shortly after the merger, several HTS leaders were assassinated, but the organization somehow managed to survive and continue their training under Jolani. By 2021, HTS had become the strongest coalition among the Free Syria rebels. Now fast forward to 2024. On November 11th, Turkey, Iran, and Russia met for the 22nd time to try and negotiate an end to the war, facilitate the return of the Syrian refugees, and implement governmental reforms. But an agreement simply could not be reached. On the exact same day, Bashar was in Saudi Arabia attending an Arab League summit where he hoped to improve relations with the Gulf and secure economic investments and strengthen his position. Just 3 days later, on November 14th, Irani intelligence warned Assad of a serious threat from HTS rebels and urged him to cooperate with their commanders. But Bashar al-Assad downplayed the threat. He was confident that he had more time and that the negotiations were going smoothly. But he was wrong. On November 27th, Israel reached a ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah in Lebanon after an exhausting and destructive year of fighting. On the very same day, HTS launched an aggressive offensive on Aleppo. In a few short days, they quickly advanced through Syrian defenses and took towns and villages on the outskirts of Aleppo. Caught by surprise, lacking morale, and lacking capable advisors, the Syrian army quickly collapsed. And by November 30th, Aleppo had fallen to the rebels. It took the Assad regime, Russia, Iran, and Shia militias 4.5 years to recapture Aleppo from the rebels between 2012 and 2016. But in just 3 days, the rebels managed to take Aleppo back. It was a humiliating and crushing blow to the regime. It had become clear that HTS had reformed itself into a professional band of fighters. It was revealed that both the Turks and the Ukrainians were training HTS rebels on how to use low-cost but effective FPV drones to eliminate regime tanks and outposts in the Aleppo area. The retreat of Assad's army also gave rebels access to the important M5 highway, giving them a direct line to travel quickly towards Hama, Homs, and the Syrian interior. On December 3rd, Irani General Jawad Ghafari traveled to Damascus to assess the situation. He determined that things were far worse than it seemed. Assad's army was in complete disarray. Panicked by this sudden and impressive offensive and the low morale of his army, Assad immediately offered an increase in salary to the soldiers he forcibly conscripted into his army to improve morale. But it was too little, too late. 2 days later, on December 5th, Hama fell to the rebels without much of a fight. Political prisoners held in Assad's notorious torture dungeons were released by the rebels in Hama, which produced videos of jubilant Syrians celebrating the success of this new offensive. The next day, a southern group out of Dar'a launched their own attack, quickly routing Assad's demoralized forces. Assad was now being attacked from two different directions. He had hoped to fight a decisive battle at the critical city of Homs, which is also positioned along the important M5 highway. But not only does Homs serve as the final major city before Damascus, it also serves as the juncture where the M1 highway links the capital to the important coastal cities of Latakia and Tartus, where Russian military bases are located. But the Syrian army was in complete disarray. On December 7th, Homs fell to the rebels without a fight. The rebels called on the rest of the Syrian army to defect, leading to widespread desertion. Assad's army then abandoned the T4 airport, the regime's largest military base east of Homs. At this point, the writing was on the wall. Assad began refusing to meet with Irani officials on December 6th. The next evening, he abandoned the capital and escaped to Moscow. Finally, on December 8th, the rebels entered Damascus to scores of Syrians cheering and celebrating the fall of the Assad regime. The Syrian prime minister agreed to cooperate with the rebels to form a transitory government and guide Syria towards elections and a new constitution. In just 12 days, the Assad regime collapsed after 50 years in power. Shortly afterwards, Erdogan declared Assad rejected Turkish calls for dialogue, confirming his support and involvement in the rebel offensive. The Israelis, fresh after their ceasefire with Hezbollah, seized upon the collapse and began bombing hundreds of Syrian positions, from bases to government buildings to naval ports, attempting to weaken Syrian infrastructure and cripple the new state as a whole. They also deployed troops into the Syrian areas of the Golan Heights, with Netanyahu declaring, "We will never withdraw." While Syrians are jubilant with the collapse of the regime and the liberation of thousands of political prisoners from Assad's torture dungeons, the future is shaky. Syria's territorial integrity is still at stake as Kurdish forces still hold territory in the northeast, the Americans occupy important oil fields and wheat farms, and Israeli troops expanding into the rest of the Golan Heights. So, what do you think? Will a Syrian civil war finally come to an end, or is there more chaos on the horizon? Let us know what you think. We will do our best to keep you informed about further developments. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to our channel. Also, if you'd like to support what we do, please consider becoming a paid subscriber on our website, where we post exclusive documentaries, podcasts, and videos just like this one about geopolitics, current events, and history. We built this website because of continued censorship of our videos, so please do consider becoming a member. Until next time.